Okay, it does seem to be working, which is great. Right. So today's lesson then, for those of you who are joining me, what I want to look at is the respiration side of your course. And if I have enough time, I will go and do some looking at photosynthesis. So let's start with respiration. So you should know that the mitochondria is the site of respiration. You should know that the equation is glucose plus oxygen goes to water and carbon dioxide. Now, it's really important that you understand what that actually means using some chemistry. So what is the chemical formula? Well, glucose, you should know, is C6H12O6. Oxygen, you know, is O2. Water, H2O. And carbon dioxide, CO2. So glucose plus oxygen is going to be in a reaction which converts it to water and carbon dioxide. Now, the key thing about the process of respiration is that it's about releasing energy. So what do we mean by releasing energy? Well, it's really important whenever you're talking about respiration that you discuss the fact that it is about releasing the energy. Now, for those of you who do decide to go on to do A level, what you'll be looking at is the fact that it's actually to do with the production of ATP. Now, be careful. This is one of the things that happens in the exam where your teacher may have already spoke to you about this production of ATP, and you then go in the exam and you then say, well, respiration is the production of energy, and you will lose a marking point by saying that. So you need to be very, very careful that what you are actually saying is that glucose and oxygen are converted into water and carbon dioxide, and this releases energy. That production of ATP molecules is for when you go on to A level. So just be very aware of that. Now, the key thing is, if you are a higher level student, you will need to remember your sixes. You have to be able to balance that equation. And because you're having to balance that equation, if there are 6 carbons, when we rearrange the molecules, we're going to end up with 6 carbon dioxides. If there's 6 on one side, and that we know that before our arrow is our reactants, let me just move this right. This is our reactants. We should therefore know that on the other side, when we're looking at after the arrow, these are our products. So when you do your chemistry, your reactants on one side should equal your products on the other side. So if I've got 6 carbon on one side, I need to ensure that I've got 6 carbon on the other side. So if I move myself over here, hold on, let me just move out of the way. You can see I've got 6 carbon dioxide at the product side because I started with a glucose molecule which had 6. Now, during exercise, you know that your blood is being pumped around by your heart. So your heart is going to be squeezing and pumping the blood around the body. I'm breathing right now, so I'm at rest. When I'm at rest, my breathing rate should be at about 16 to 18 breaths per minute. Now, my breath volume that I have as well is to do with the amount of space I have in my thoracic cavity. So if I'm going to do exercise, if I'm going to go outside, I'm going to go for a run, what's going to happen is my heart rate after I've started running is going to increase. My breathing rate is going to increase. The breath volume, the amount of air that I'm trying to get into my lungs, is also going to increase. Why is that? Well, it's really important that you remember that when we are looking at respiration, we had 2 reactants that were required. Glucose was one of those reactants. Oxygen was the other reactant. So if I'm going to do lots and lots of exercise, I'm therefore going to need to release lots of energy. So if I'm going to release lots of energy, I'm going to need to be doing lots of respiration, because one of the things to remember is when you look at your exercise, my muscles will need to contract. If my muscles need to contract, they therefore need lots of energy. And if they need lots of energy, how are they going to be able to provide the necessary ATP molecules to release that energy? Well, that is where respiration comes in. And I have to be very specific when I talk about aerobic respiration. So if I'm going to do exercise, my muscles are going to contract more. I need lots of energy, and therefore aerobic respiration is going to happen at a faster rate. So by increasing my heart rate, what I'm actually doing is I'm pumping the blood faster around the body. By increasing my breathing rate, I am going to ensure that there is a faster rate of gas exchange. Because remember, one of my reactants is the oxygen. One of my products is the carbon dioxide. So I need to have CO2 exchanged for O2. So I need to increase my breathing rate. And by increasing my breath volume, that means I have got more air inside my lungs. And if I've got more air inside my lungs, that therefore means I will be able to actually have that concentration gradient. So I spoke last week about the concentration gradient and the diffusion of molecules. And this is where it interlinks with the topic area of bioenergetics. Respiration is that glucose plus oxygen and that reaction occurring within the mitochondria that results in carbon dioxide and water being produced as waste products. So I need to understand that these gases are going to be diffusing. And if I've got more air inside my lungs, I am therefore affecting the concentration gradient. So when I do exercise, I therefore need to have an increase in my heart rate, an increase in my breathing rate, and an increase in my breath volume. And then what I need to understand is, oh, hello, I'm so sorry. I did not realize that you had been writing some comments there. Thank you for your comments. I am doing a lesson on respiration for GCSE. So if you're studying your GCSE and you are looking at how to improve your grades, then that is what I am doing now. Okay, so let's just do a little bit more on this then. So the other thing I need to note is my waste products, my carbon dioxide and my water also need to be removed. So by me increasing my heart rate, by me increasing my breathing rate, by me increasing my breath volume, what I'm actually doing is I am supplying the oxygen and the glucose because they are transported in the blood, and that allows for aerobic respiration to occur. By having the blood being circulated around, the waste products, carbon dioxide, that is also going to be able to be removed from the bloodstream when it gets up to the lungs. So this increase is really important, but it's not just about understanding that the heart rate increases, the breath rate increases, or the breath volume. What you will need to do for your exam is you need to actually be able to give the information as to why it's happening. Why is it that you need that increase in the oxygen and glucose? Now, glucose is a really important reactant for respiration. So we need glucose to be present. And so therefore what happens is we store glucose, but we can't store it as glucose. And the reason we can't store it as glucose, again, links to my lesson last week. If you understand that glucose is a soluble molecule, i.e. it can dissolve in the cytoplasm, what's going to happen is if glucose dissolves in the cytoplasm, it will affect the osmotic potential of the cell. Now, because it affects the osmotic potential of the cell, that could cause the cell to take in too much water by osmosis. And so therefore, to stop that, what our muscle and liver cells do is they actually convert glucose into a bigger molecule, glycogen, and therefore that is where it is stored. So glucose can be stored as glycogen. If you're doing homeostasis right now, you will be learning about how insulin and glucagon, two hormones, are needed for ensuring that that storage is happening, or is needed to release the glucose if you don't have any glucose in your any glucose in your bloodstream is not true if you have a lowered glucose level in your bloodstream, because you would never get no glucose. Okay, so if it's not aerobic respiration, then if it's not in the presence of oxygen, it's known as anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration means without oxygen. Now, for those of you who are watching this, you will notice I'm writing all over the board, and I'm not going to pretend that I am the best writer. I'm not going to pretend. This is something I've done earlier. I'm doing these sessions live. As you're watching these, I hope you're enjoying it. And the one thing I would say to you is, if you are like me, if your writing isn't maybe as good as it could be, then I would say make sure you take your time when writing the answer in the exam. Because as an examiner, what we see is a picture of your written answer on a screen that we're looking at, and we are then using that to grade whether you're going to get the mark or not. And obviously we do that against the mark scheme. But if your writing isn't very good and we struggle to read your writing, we will try our best. But actually, if we can't read it, there's not much we can do with giving you those marks. So just be aware, I know my writing's not the greatest, so therefore I know if I'm in an exam or if I am doing something that needs me to take more care, I will actually take the time to write it. But I'm doing this really quick for you, so therefore I'm not that bothered about my writing. But it is something I would say to be aware of. So what's the point in anaerobic respiration? Well, aerobic respiration is obviously going to happen with the presence of oxygen and the breaking down of glucose and producing ATP molecules, as I said before. However, it takes time for the oxygen to get there. And so before the oxygen has been supplied to the mitochondria for aerobic respiration, we actually do anaerobic respiration. So if you think about doing a sprint, if you're sprinting, you are not going to be supplying the oxygen at a fast enough rate, and therefore you're relying on stores that you have in your muscle cells already to provide the necessary energy for you to do whatever that activity may be. So you actually do anaerobic respiration first before you do aerobic respiration. If you go on to A level, you will learn more about the first part of both anaerobic and aerobic respiration actually does not involve oxygen. So that's something you would potentially go on to learn if you decide that A-level biology is for you. But let's look at the GCSE part of it then. So anaerobic without oxygen, and every student loves to say that because that's the easy part. It's releasing a really small amount of energy. So remember, whenever we're comparing, aerobic respiration produces lots of energy. Anaerobic respiration, a smaller amount of energy. So it's only 2 ATP molecules. And that's because what we're actually going to do is what's known as an incomplete oxidation of glucose in the absence of oxygen. So if we have our glucose molecule, and we remember that glucose molecule is C6H12O6, we are going to break it down. But because we can't break it down fully, there's 2 types you need to know. If we are looking at animals, then the animals will break the glucose down into lactic acid. So they're going to break that glucose down into lactic acid, and therefore that is going to provide 2 ATP molecules, releasing a small amount of energy. And that energy could be used, as we were talking about last week, it could be used for example, active transport. Now, I don't know what it's like where you are right now, but it is freezing here. It's really, really cold. My hands are absolutely frozen. So therefore, the fact that I am an endotherm, I am an organism that has to maintain my temperature, my internal temperature, I therefore may need to use the energy released to actually keep me at the right temperature, which is about 36.5 to 37 degrees C. So as animals, we need a supply of energy, and because we need a supply of energy, where does it come from? It comes from this anaerobic respiration, but produces lactic acid. Now, you have to also know about plants and yeast. So plants and yeast are not animals, because an animal cell does not have a cell wall, whereas plants and yeast both have a cell wall. Now, their cell wall is made of different materials, but at the moment, the key thing of what we're going to distinguish between our animals and our plants and yeast is this presence of a cell wall. Now, plants, we know, also have chloroplasts. Yeast cells do not. Yeast cells are a type of fungi, and they do not have chloroplasts. So be careful when you're looking at your cell structure that you do know how is it that I am meant to distinguish between my animals, my plants, and my yeast. And this is where biology is the bigger picture. You need to be looking at all the different parts and seeing how they link together. So what do the plants and yeast cells do? Well, when they anaerobically respire, they will produce alcohol. So they will produce alcohol, which is, for example, a process called ethanol is the alcohol that they produce. And that ethanol is therefore going to be used if we as humans want to utilize that material. But for the plants and the yeast, they are doing this, producing the alcohol as a waste product from anaerobic respiration. Now, they also, plants and yeast, produce carbon dioxide, whereas we don't. So because they produce carbon dioxide as well, what we can do is we can actually identify the fact that the yeast is really good at, for example, baking. So lactic acid is toxic. Alcohol is toxic if it remains at high concentrations. Now, lactic acid can actually be broken down into carbon dioxide and water. So we can convert lactic acid to the carbon dioxide and water, but only if oxygen is actually delivered, and that oxygen debt which we've created through anaerobic respiration must be repaid. So when I spoke earlier, I spoke about the fact that if you were sprinting, you would be using anaerobic respiration. Well, that anaerobic respiration is going to produce lactic acid. That lactic acid needs to be broken down into the carbon dioxide and water, and therefore oxygen is required to repay the debt that you've built up through the exercise that you did. So it's important to note that the oxygen debt that you have built up through doing the anaerobic respiration is repaid by, for example, it taking you time before your breathing rate gets back down to that resting state, before the volume gets back down to that normal resting volume. So it's really important that you interlink those different parts together. Now, alcohol can be used in the fermentation process. So for alcoholic drinks, and as I said before, the carbon dioxide, these bubbles that can be produced of gases will actually make your dough rise up. So if you're doing bread making, if you've ever put your flour and your water and your yeast together and left it and it will rise up, what's going to happen is you'll start to see some bubbles in the yeast and flour mixture, and those bubbles are carbon dioxide bubbles that have been produced through aerobic respiration. If you have provided it with oxygen, when the oxygen has disappeared, it will continue to do anaerobic respiration. So when you cover it with cling film, what you're doing is you are controlling the volume of oxygen that is inside your container. Well, if they're going to continue to do respiration, they will then be able to break down the glucose, but this time through anaerobic respiration. So the two of them are happening simultaneously. The key thing is oxygen present or is oxygen not? So are they doing both aerobic and anaerobic, or are they only doing anaerobic when there's no oxygen present? So what would a question look like about respiration? And this is the thing that I love about doing practice papers. The more practice papers that you do, the more experience you will get of, one, seeing the types of questions that they ask, and two, being able to think like an examiner. So this question is worth 2 marks. It would like me, and it's used a command word here, to describe. I'm going to describe 2 differences between my aerobic respiration and my anaerobic respiration. And it has specifically said in the questions that this is in humans. So therefore I know I do not want to be talking about those plants or the yeast. So that's the first thing, to read the question and identify the hints in the question. You would be surprised how many students read a question like this in the exam, they skim read it, and they only get up to that part in the question. Describe 2 differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, and they're like, yes, I'm gonna go. And they start writing, and what they're writing isn't actually answering the question. And that can be frustrating for you as a student, because it means you're not able to show your actual understanding. But it's also frustrating for us as examiners, because we're like, just read the question, please. Take your time. So I always say, read the question the first time, you think you know what it's asking you. Read the question the second time, you've got a better understanding of what that question's asking you. And if you read it a third time, you absolutely do know what that question is asking you. So please do take your time when reading these questions so that you know exactly how to maximize your grade. So what does it want to know? Well, the differences. So this is a comparative between the two. What is the difference? Well, we know that aerobic respiration is going to produce carbon dioxide. So if I go aerobic respiration produces carbon dioxide, then I have given a difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, right? No. Again, this is what students do. They start writing an answer, but they only ever give half the answer. Anaerobic respiration produces carbon dioxide. However, anaerobic does not. Be explicit with your answer. This one does this, whereas that one does that. So what else can we say? What's another difference between the two? Well, aerobic respiration produces lots of ATP, whereas anaerobic respiration produces 2 ATP molecules. What else can we say? Anaerobic respiration produces lactic acid because they have specified that it is in humans, so we know that it's lactic acid. What do we need to then say? Aerobic respiration does not. And what we do as examiners, and if you look at mark schemes, you'll see they'll be on the same lines. That means each line is worth 1 mark. So if you aren't giving us each line, you are not going to get the mark without both those statements. The other thing to note as well is that we've also got aerobic respiration produces water, whereas anaerobic respiration does not. So do make sure you are giving your comparative statements so that you can maximize those grades. Okay, let's have a look at another type of question. So here we go. 2 students are discussing respiration. One student says, I know all animals respire, but I don't think plants need to. Explain why the student's statement is not correct. This is another one that seems to throw students, even though the exam boards highlight it by putting it in bold, students miss that word not for some reason. I don't know why, but they do seem to miss that word. So what's the key thing to note here? Well, the key thing to know is we're talking about plants. Plant cells obviously have mitochondria. So if they have mitochondria, they therefore do aerobic respiration. However, it doesn't say whether it's aerobic or whether it's anaerobic respiration. It just says respiration. So where does anaerobic respiration happen? Well, anaerobic respiration occurs in the cytoplasm. And because anaerobic respiration occurs here, that therefore tells us plant cells have cytoplasm. They also do anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So they actually will do respiration. Also, respiration is needed for all of the processes that are happening inside the cell. Energy demanding processes like active transport. So therefore, plants will actually need that energy because plants do active transport. And what do we know about active transport? Active transport is about, let's try that again. My writing is atrocious. Transport. Active transport we know is going against the concentration gradient. And we know that because it's going against the concentration gradient, energy is required. Now, if you're just joining me and this is the first time you've ever come across my sessions, you'll be wondering why I tend to repeat myself quite a lot. One of the things that you should know is the more you repeat the content, the more you get into a habit of saying these things out loud or writing these things down again and again and again, the more you will link that and therefore give the answers to the questions. I'm not just going to give you the mark schemes, because you can find these papers, you can find the mark schemes, you can find how to get the right answers, but that doesn't mean you understand it. And that's the other thing a lot of students do. They think if they just read the mark schemes, they regurgitate the mark schemes and they memorize it, they will get those marks. But it's not the case. You need to understand the science so that you can then apply it to the question, especially if you're aiming from that 7 up to that 9 grades. Okay, so be aware, if you are aiming high, you need to fully understand what is going on and be able to give more detail to maximize your grade, because they may take a question like this and it not be a 2 marker, but instead it could be a 5 marker. So could you give enough to make it 5 marks? So if it's not active transport we're talking about, it could be that they want you to understand that mitosis, cell division, is an energy demanding process. So if the cells need to go through mitosis, if cell division is required, energy is needed for the cells to go through the mitotic process. Well, we're talking about plants here. We're talking about plants that grow continuously. They get longer roots, they grow taller so they can keep photosynthesizing. What exam board, please? Well, I've aimed this revision session mainly on AQA/OCR. I'm bringing questions from lots of different exam boards. The content for GCSE is very much across all the exam boards, pretty much the same. It just depends how they've put them into each of the different modules. So this is module 1 for OCR, for example, whereas if you're AQA, this is bioenergetics, which is module 3, 4 for you guys. So it just depends what exam board you're doing, making sure that you know which papers it's going to come up in. Now, I mainly teach AQA when it comes to GCSE, so I know that one more inside and out. However, A-level side of things, I do both AQA and OCR, so I've brought in both because they are the biggest exam boards that are studied this year. In fact, in most years. So I just wanted to make sure the resources should allow you to do either exam board. However, just always refer back to what I would call your cheat sheet, which is your specification. Okay, I've got probably about 12 minutes left before I need to get prepped for my A-level group session. So I want to start and do a little bit on photosynthesis, because respiration is really important, but they love to link it with photosynthesis. So we've talked about how the animals and the plants and yeast are able to do respiration. So now let's see how we can link that to photosynthesis and how they can come together. But guys, please do feel free, if you have any questions, to type them in the chat. I will answer them as I am going. I want this to be informative for you, but also where I do identify any misconceptions you may have or help you as much as I can. So what do we need to know about photosynthesis then? Well, photosynthesis is something that happens in plant cells. Why is it happening in plant cells? Because plant cells have chloroplasts. So one of the ways in which we can distinguish between an animal cell and a plant cell is this presence of a chloroplast. Now that is the site of photosynthesis. It's an endothermic reaction. So your chemistry expects you to know whether it's exothermic or whether it's endothermic. So the chloroplast doing photosynthesis is an endothermic reaction, and that is because the energy, which is light energy, here comes in some physics, we have light energy that is going to be absorbed by the chloroplast. And when that light energy is absorbed by the chloroplast, it is then going to be transferred and stored in the molecules that it makes, i.e. chemical energy, glucose. So we should know that this is an endothermic reaction. because that energy is being transferred from the environment to the chloroplast. So we know that the plant needs water. We know that the plant needs carbon dioxide. So where does the water come from? Well, you should know that the water is coming from the roots and is then transported via the xylem, which is a tissue for transporting the water up to the leaves. So the chloroplast, that site of photosynthesis, occurs in any place within the plant which has chloroplast. So we tend to talk about the leaves mainly because that is where you see the most chloroplast when we talk about the upper layer with that palisade mesophyll. However, note that the stem is also there. Chidima, what are you doing here? You're A-level. This is GCSE, but hi. I'll be on later on tonight, by the way, for some A-level revision. So please do come back. You have a very quick question. Try and go and ask the question. Try not to freak out too many GCSE students, but ask the question and I'll continue with this while you're typing. So water's been transported up, absorbed by the roots, through the xylem to the leaves. Carbon dioxide is the carbon dioxide is going to come in through the leaves, through the stomata. Chidima, the photosynthesis videos that I've just put out, the long videos, that is photosynthesis going into all of the videos being put together, but not me just taking my old videos and put them together. I've made that brand new, but I've made it so it's the story of photosynthesis for you. So they are different. They're not exactly the old ones, but they're the updated version of that, basically. And it takes you right the way through the whole of photosynthesis and transpiration and translocation if you go for the big long one, which has got it all. Hope that helps. Okay, back to this equation. We have our water, we've got our carbon dioxide. We're going to produce glucose. Glucose, which is going to be needed for respiration. So this is where we talk about this interconnected relationship that photosynthesis and respiration have. So this is going to be used for respiration. Whether that's anaerobic or aerobic is dependent on the presence of oxygen. So oxygen is obviously produced as a waste product for photosynthesis, and oxygen could actually leave through the stomata and go out to the atmosphere. So if the oxygen leaves through the stomata through the process of gas exchange, then that's going to result in the oxygen not being present for respiration. But also the oxygen could be used for aerobic respiration. So the oxygen's fate depends on where it's required. If it's in surplus, it's going to leave the plant. If it's needed, it's going to be used in the mitochondria for respiration. So we have to remember our sixes. We cannot forget about our sixes because we're going to be making glucose here, a C6 molecule. We need 6 carbon dioxide, we need 6 water, and we are going to produce 6 oxygen. So chloroplast, site of photosynthesis, here's my equation. I need to be able to balance it, but what is missing? What have I not really spoke about? I've not spoke about the light very much. So I need to now bring in light and talk about what happens with light. So you should know what's known as the inverse square law. So if I am to take a light source, so let's say I have a lamp. So my light source is my lamp. And what I'm going to do is I am going to place that close to or far away from a plant that is photosynthesizing. So if I want to look at photosynthesis, I'm going to take a plant, for example, Elodea, and I'm going to place that plant into water which is going to have a source of carbon dioxide. So I'm probably going to put it into a hydrogen carbonate solution. So if I do that, I will then be looking at how much oxygen is being produced. Now, if I move my plant further away from my lamp and I move it further away, look at what's happening to my rays of light. So you should know, because you've been learning your physics, you should know that light travels as a wavelength, and that light travels as a wavelength in straight lines. And therefore, if I am moving my plant closer or further away, I'm affecting how much that light is going to be spread out. And if that light is going to be spread out, that's therefore going to affect the intensity that the plant is being exposed to. So if I understand that, and I understand my inverse square law, if you move the light source double the distance, the intensity will be a quarter of the original. So it's really important that you're thinking about light intensity and how the light is being spread out. Well, we can see that right now. We are in the throes of winter. It's freezing today. We have less light. It's getting darker earlier and it's not as warm. Why is that? And it's because of the way in which we are tilted on our axis. And so we're actually experiencing the spreading out of light through the fact that we, because of where we are in the UK, we are in the start of winter and it's really, really cold. Well, the light levels also change and the intensity of that light can be calculated using the inverse square law. And we do that through 1 divided by the distance squared. So if we know, for example, that we have got our plant and it is, let's say, 10 centimeters away from my light source, what is the light intensity? Well, I would take 1 and I would divide it by 10 squared. And if I just use my calculator for that, so 10, try that again, 1 divided by 10. This is another thing I would say to you. If you're anything like me, you need to be very careful that you don't make mistakes by putting numbers in the wrong place. So 1 divided by 10 squared is equal to 0.01. Now, if I were to move my plant to 20 centimeters now, what have I got? Well, now I need to do 1 over 20 squared. So my light intensity would be 1 over 20 squared, and that would therefore equal 0.0025. Now, what's really interesting is if we were going to look at this, normally when we're talking about our light intensity, we would say, for example, it's either in, what is this doing on my feed? I'm glad it has come on your feed and I'm glad that you're here and asking questions. Thank you. We would actually talk about this as arbitrary, oh my word, I can't spell. That's the other thing. I am also dyslexic, so I do this completely the wrong way around. So arbitrary units is what I would be saying. And therefore, if I'm told that 20 centimeters equals 25 arbitrary units at 20 centimeters, can I work out what the arbitrary units are for the 10 centimeters? So they could also, if they're looking at that top end, try and bring in some maths here and look at your conversion. So if I know that I have to move 4 places to get to my 25 arbitrary units, then I need to do the same thing at the 10. And so I need to add in 2 extra zeros. So for 20 centimeters, it was 25 arbitrary units, 10 centimeters, 100 arbitrary units. So they'll either give it to you where they want you to do a bit of calculation, or they'll do it where they want you to actually say, well, how would you be able to tell? How would you test and control the light intensity? So I would control the light intensity by keeping my sample, my specimen, whatever it may be, if I'm doing it in a test tube, at the same distance. But if I were unable to keep it at the same distance, if I was having to have it move, what could I do and what should I do? I should measure. So if you cannot control, measure the light intensity. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. I am going to stop now because I now need to get myself ready for my A-level group session that I'm about to run. I hope you guys are finding these useful. I hope that you are liking them, and please do share. I will come back. I'm going to do this up to Christmas. I will come back next week. I will do maybe a little bit more on photosynthesis and then look at some more topic areas. So please do keep coming and asking your questions. Keep watch the videos, and if you have questions, please write them, because I will try to make more videos for you on GCSE. What I'm noticing more and more with my A-level students is that so many students are missing key GCSE fundamental building blocks of knowledge, which means the A-level is so much harder. So I want to make it easier for you guys. Obviously, I do these for free, so if you like them and share them, then it means that it puts it out there, and hopefully I'll be able to keep making more. But thank you everybody for joining me.